Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Conflict is a part of life, whether we're talking about our professional life or our personal life. So sometimes when it comes to the workplace, conflict happens. And as much as we would like to think that we have what it takes, we have the skills to resolve conflict successfully, it's not always easy to do that. And when left unresolved, conflict can lead to bigger problems. When we talk about unresolved conflict at work, we could be looking at effects such as loss of productivity or loss of engagement, loss of motivation. Unresolved conflict at work could lead to unhappy employees, and in long term, certainly, it can affect health and well-being. Retaining good employees could also fall in this category of something that could become an issue when conflict at work is unresolved. Unresolved conflict can affect the environment around you, and it can affect other employees. It's not just limited to affecting those people who are directly involved in the conflict. It can affect the environment and others around you, and ultimately it can affect the well-being of the organization itself. It's not difficult to see why resolving conflict at work and doing so skillfully, successfully, and quickly is an important consideration for all of us who enjoy time at the workplace. In this episode, I will introduce you to some best practices for better, more effective conflict resolution at the workplace. What's important to remember from the start is that these best practices are equally as important, equally as valuable for those people who may be involved in the conflict directly, as it is for those in management position. Sometimes we as managers have to intervene in order for conflict resolution to be at its finest. So remember, as you're learning the best practices during today's episode, this is equally as valuable information for management as it is for people who may be involved in the conflict directly. As you learn about these conflict resolution best practices, it's important that you go into it with an open mind and a quieted ego, regardless of your position or your involvement, whether you're part of the conflict, whether you're a third party or a mediator or a manager. That brings me to the first thing. If you are in the middle of a conflict, make sure that you consider the possibility that a third party, a mediator of some sort, may be required in order to resolve that conflict successfully. That's not always the case, but it may be the case sometimes. So it's important to know that, to realize that, and to be okay with that. After all, if our goal is successful conflict resolution, it should happen in a way that gets us to that end goal in the best way possible. And if that means that a mediator, a third party of some sort, will be helpful, then that's what we do. But that's not always a requirement. That's not always necessary for successful conflict resolution. The first best practice for successful conflict resolution is to find a private, safe space to talk, to have a conversation. You don't want to have that conversation in the middle of everything and everyone, where others are watching, listening, and potentially contributing to the conversation, and maybe their contribution makes things worse. So you want a private place to have a conversation about the conflict at hand. It's important to clarify the source of the conflict, and by that I don't mean blaming the other person. It's important to understand why the conflict even exists. So identify the source of the conflict. What is the problem? The conflict could be identified as many different things, from simple personality differences to a disagreement on how to get things done in the best, most efficient way. Sometimes we don't even know that the goals that we have are not the same goal, and that could lead to conflict. So this is why it's so important to identify conflict. Sometimes the conflict, or the source of the conflict, is nothing more than a misunderstanding, and clarifying that misunderstanding could put an end to the conflict right there and then. It's important that we keep things professional and productive. Leave emotions and blame and finger pointing out of it. This is not the place or time. It's never a time and place for that kind of behavior at work anyway. But this is especially important if we're looking to have conflict resolution that is successful. Everyone involved should get their say on the topic. They should be able to speak their mind, keeping in mind that we want to be respectful of others. And it's important that if it's not your turn to speak on the topic of whatever this conflict is, then you need to be respectful and engage in some active listening, so that the person sharing whatever their contribution to the conversation is being heard in terms of where they see or how they see the conflict. Once we understand what the source of the conflict is, and we've given everybody a chance to speak on their interpretation of what's happening, it's important that collectively, whether it's just you or one more person, or if it's a larger group of people, it's important that everybody agree on what conflict resolution looks like, what successful conflict resolution looks like. It has to be a goal that everybody agrees on, because we can't resolve the conflict if everybody has a totally different goal in mind. So we have to identify and agree on a common goal, a common end of the road, if you will, for the conflict in order for successful conflict resolution to occur. Once we know and agree on that desired outcome, it's important to make a plan of who needs to do what in order for that desired outcome, that goal, to be reached. Now, this can be tricky sometimes, especially if we're already in the middle of a conflict. This is where a third party may come in handy, a mediator or a manager who could help you come up with a plan and assigned tasks to different people so that collectively you could reach conflict resolution. If conflict resolution can happen right there and then, that's great, but that's not always the case. Sometimes certain things have to happen towards that desired outcome. If that's the case, it's important to come back and reassess the situation to make sure that you're moving forward in the right direction towards successful conflict resolution. And if corrections need to be made, that's the time to make those corrections. It's also important to identify if and when the conflict has been successfully resolved, meaning it's agreeable to everyone's liking. It's what everybody expected. Now, this is important to remember, that we have to be willing to work with one another. We have to be willing to be cooperative and to compromise. The reality of conflict resolution is such that you won't always get exactly what you want. You won't always get things to go your way 100%. But if we want successful conflict resolution, and this is so important in life in general, but especially at work, it's important that we're able to work with one another and compromise so that collectively we come to a successful conflict resolution. Once you're able to verify that everyone's good with where you are, that the conflict is officially resolved in a successful way, then we move on with life. As you can see, these best practices for successful conflict resolution are pretty straightforward, nothing mysterious here, but the key to our success is actually following these steps, actually being engaged and conducting ourselves in such a way that is respectful towards everybody, and that is also confirming our interest in successful conflict resolution. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. As you already know, conflict is a part of life, and sometimes conflict happens at work. It can be costly when left unattended, unresolved, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are some very simple best practices that we can all engage in order to improve our chances of resolving conflict successfully. It's important to remember that these practices are just as valuable for those individuals who are directly involved in the conflict as it is for management or third-party mediators who may become involved in the situation in terms of resolution or finding resolution for the conflict at hand. Understand that although it's not always the case, sometimes a mediator or a third party may be required in order for the conflict to be resolved successfully. First and foremost, find a private place to talk and identify the source or the root of the conflict. It's important to be respectful, to allow everybody to have a say, and to engage in active listening. Define a desired outcome, something that everyone can agree on, and formulate a plan of action of who needs to do what in order for the conflict to be successfully resolved. Sometimes conflict resolution can happen right there and then. Other times it may take some time for that to happen. If the conflict resolution requires some time, make sure to come back and check on your progress. Make sure that you're heading in the right direction. And remember to be willing to work with others and compromise. After all, that's how successful conflict resolution really happens. As the week unfolds, I encourage you to think about your own ability to resolve conflict successfully. And your own abilities are not the only thing that is responsible for successful conflict resolution, because it takes at least two people to be in conflict and to resolve the conflict. But the better your skills are, the better your chances of reaching successful conflict resolution. So take what you've learned here today and apply it in your own experiences as you encounter conflict at work or anywhere else for that matter. For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. In addition to the podcast, my YouTube channel also contains videos that focus on stress management. So I encourage you to check that out. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.